Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Advanced Project Management. This is Ghazala Amin with your PRM700, the Advanced Project Management class within your MSPM course. MS in Project Management involves a lot of things, a lot of information, all shared by experiences that you may or may not have at this point in time, but are ready to observe and gain within the period of either a semester or trying to get the terms and terminologies under your belt for many more years to come. And inshallah you will all make, and if you not already are, great project managers. You will be considered the professionals and you will be considered the stars of the show when real life projects come your way. Last lecture we talked about project scope management plan, one of the knowledge areas within PMBOK, and started in the planning phases of the project, and then refined, processed and improved upon in the monitoring and the control phase by doing a change control scope. So let's look at the 5 processes that make up the project scope management plan. The first process is the collecting of requirements, defining and identifying the scope, defining of scope, creation of a work breakdown structure, the drilling deep into it and taking the defined scope and breaking that apart into other activities and sub-activities. Moving on to the monitoring and control phase of the project, we have 2 processes within the project scope management plan, and which is the verification of scope and then controlling of scope. In the last lecture, we talked about and we drilled deep into collecting requirements. A lot of different terms and terminologies that were shared with you. Under the collecting of requirements, the result was 2 high-level bullets. One was statement of work and the other one was project scope management plan. We identified the need for hiring professionals and experienced resources into creating what we call statement of work or the scope statement. I should not use the term statement of work because again statement of work has different definition, but let's stick ourselves to the term scope statement. When we use the word scope statement, we need to ensure that we are focusing on tangible data, focusing on data that can be measured, tangible data. Stay clear from adjectives, stay clear from words that can have dual meanings. So, having done all that, the next resulting document would be your scope management plan. In the previous lecture, we talked about the scope management plan having certain required contents as headers. One thing we did acquire was that the scope management plan should ultimately be a standard template within your organization, and the reason for being standard because scope management plan document focuses on the processes and it forms the basis of commitment between the customer and the project organization. So the processes need to be identified and committed. We're going to look at other processes within the project scope management plan, and this all is based on the PMBOK version of project scope management plan knowledge area. From after collecting of requirements, we are going to drill deep into something called scope definition. It involves subdividing the major project deliverables into smaller, more manageable components. So once we've collected all the requirements, we're going to drill deep into defining of that scope. So we're going to take the project scope and the product scope and subdivide into smaller, more manageable activities that we can focus on, and we can actually have people responsible for achieving those targets. Under the scope definition, we're going to use the scope statement to form the basis of project definition. The scope definition or the scope statement will again be used as a foundation for building more components on. This would be used to plan outputs used by the company, or the planning outputs that are used by the company. We're going to utilize all those. Lessons learned will be utilized, data from other similar projects, consultants or human resources that have worked on other similar projects, their input will be used. Then the historical information. Similar projects that have been done by this organization, similar work activities, documentation, what is available on the website, the expertise, the consultants, the subject matter experts, all that information is taken. Documentation not just from the project organization but also from the customer organization are utilized in this activity, all to come up with defining a scope statement. Not just the scope statement but actually defining scope of the project. All this would result in a very, very significant aspect or significant output, which is called the WBS, the work breakdown structure. Within the project planning outputs, we shared with you different structures for WBS. Some were broken down by phases, some were broken down by deliverables, some look like organization chart. If you go into Microsoft Project, you can subdivide that into 1.0, 1.0, 6-level indented structure. The definition has been shared with you in previous slides. If you go do Wikipedia search, you're going to come up with another definition or similar definition of WBS, work breakdown structure. Bottom line is the WBS is taking the initial scope of what you have, the scope as defined and identified at this point in time, and breaking it down into activities that will take the project from point A to point Z, from the initiation phase to the initial activities to the closure activities, making sure that all activities are grouped hierarchically into more manageable components and should always be taken down to the level where individual resources can be assigned to it. The work package and the level of effort are the two bottom or the lower indented structures of the WBS. WBS ensures that all work within a project is identified and defined within a common framework. So WBS takes all of the activities and defines it, identifies it, and drills it down into more manageable activities. It's a continuous movement. WBS is identified at a high level. More resources are acquired, added on to the project, and they drill it down to another level, and more definition is added to it. subsequent activities are added to it, more detailed information is added to it. So taking a very high level pictorial view of what needs to be done is then drilled down into more manageable tasks. Work breakdown structure. It's a deliverable-oriented grouping of project components. WBS is a 6-level indented structure. Starts off with a total program, taken down to project, then the task, subtask, work package, and the level of effort. Work package is the deliverable at the lower level of the work breakdown structure. Most of the time we do not take it down to the level of effort. We will just stop at the work package level. In most cases, depending on the complexity or depending on the intensity of the project, we actually drill it down to the level of effort. WBS is initially developed in the scope definition phase of the project. So it's in the planning phase of the project and should be used as a responsibility and accountability team building tool. I'm going to spend maybe a couple of minutes on the word responsibility and accountability, and then work my way to the team building tool, because these are highlighted and underlined. WBS taken down to the level of who will do what activity. When it is taken down to that level, there is also an estimate that goes along with it. But you can always, once the team member's name is associated with a task, you can use this tool as an accountability tool. So a person is responsible, or a human resource is responsible for doing a task. That person should commit to doing that particular task on budget, on time, the committed time, the committed estimate, or the committed estimated time. At that point in time, that person is taking responsibility. And an example that I have used with you, if somebody is responsible and accountable for delivering a certain report by 5 p.m. on a Friday evening, and it is Thursday afternoon, and you realize that there is more work required on it than what is anticipated between now and Friday 5 p.m., and it involves working 3 hours today evening more, then if you feel accountable, then you will actually spend that time gladly, because you do want that report to be out by Friday 5 p.m. And the reason is because you were responsible for that task and you feel accountable for delivering it on a committed time frame. The team building tool. The world's best WBSs are done when everybody feels committed to it. Remember, it's done, WBS is initially created in the planning phase and you have minimal resources. So what would be the scenario to use this as a team building tool? The best way for a WBS or creation of a WBS is to get the team together, whoever is part of that project team at that point in time. Get them in a room and start with a whiteboard, a clean board, and start listing activities. As a team building tool, people will start dribbling into sub-activities or activities that you as a project manager may not have thought of, or you are aided by a consultant who gives you more details into what is required to achieve the target. Remember, even if you are not working on estimates at this point in time, within the team, your team input will be needed to come up with activities for delivering the required or desired product. Everybody will pitch in. You will have a list of activities. If you want to drill it down into estimates, people will give estimates of how long do they think it will take to do a certain task. If the person who is responsible for doing it, for example, for creating a web page, says it will take 5 days or a week, or it will take 7 days to do a certain task, a consultant would say maybe it can be done in 5 days. Between the discussion, you can come up with an estimated time of 6 days to do that particular task. If that person who's responsible for doing it ultimately becomes the resource for accomplishing that task, he or she will feel accountable for delivering that particular web page in 6 days. Sometimes it may take a little bit more, not just the time but more effort. That person will gladly put in that time. And this is the difference between just being responsible to being accountable for that, meeting that target. In all these discussions, what needs to be clear in everybody's head is the project priority and the reasons for making the commitment and meeting the targeted delivery date. Why is it so important to deliver something on target? The bigger picture of it. And it's the project manager's responsibility to ensure that every project team member and the sponsor and the project organization understand that meeting those targets and those milestone dates are extremely important and are matter of life and death. This hype up when created creates a committed team who's bent upon delivering on time, on budget, on schedule. With that mindset, let's progress. So the work breakdown structure. The WBS serves as the framework on which project is built and as the map for project execution. WBS focuses attention on project objectives and encourages detailed planning and documentation. So the first one is, obviously it's a framework. You start off from the initiation and the planning phase and take it down to the end result. So it's a framework, and you will drill down into activities or add on new activities no matter what you're doing, but you're creating this little roadmap that will take you from project initiation to successful delivery of the project. WBS focuses attention on project objectives. So once subtasks are identified, people who are responsible for delivering that will come up with subsequent activities underneath it that provides another indented level of WBS. So under providing a report, report A, the person who will be responsible for delivering report A will come up with subsequent levels underneath it or sub-activities that will help him or her to deliver report A. So that continuous movement of drilling down ultimately to the level of effort or to the work package level focuses the attention of responsible individuals to project objectives, and also obviously is encouraging planning and documentation. WBS also clarifies responsibilities and identifies elements for estimating and work assignment. So if you keep drilling down, you will come down to a level of who will be doing what activity, and you're using this WBS for subsequent planning. So you're ultimately going to assign people to those sub-activities. You're going to start estimating the schedule based on what you have identified. So, listing of all the activities, the time frame or the time schedule or the time estimate required to do those activities, and subsequently who will be doing or who will be responsible for achieving those activities. All that will aim towards clarifying responsibilities and ultimately giving the responsible individuals the feeling of accountability. WBS is used throughout the project, so it's a continuous and a continual process. It needs to be revised in event of any changes or updates. So when there are new changes that come up, new activities approved through the change control board, minor changes, major changes, all that will be added on, or if there are certain functionalities that will be deleted then or minimized, then you will take those activities out of the WBS. No matter what is happening, it's a living and a breathing document that keeps getting modified and updated throughout the life of the project, moving on until the closure phase of the project. No matter how it is used, how often is it used, whatever it is, WBS is the cornerstone of quality project planning. Without WBS, you cannot explain how long will it take, what it comprises of, what it consists of, and ultimately to the level that if a project sponsor wants or should insist on a complete, let me reiterate, take it back. A project sponsor should insist on a complete and updated WBS to ensure that a project manager can answer all key questions pertaining to the project activities and status of the project. So when you talk about, or when you as a sponsor or as a project sponsor wants to get a comfort level that the project manager knows what he or she is doing and is capable of actually doing this project or meeting the targets of the project, then one good question will be to insist upon a complete WBS and to review it on a periodical basis to understand how much detail is that project manager is putting on, or how much emphasis that project manager is putting on the activity of creating of a WBS, work breakdown structure. So as a project manager, we looked at different, and there's no hard and fast rule of how or what a WBS should look like. The understanding is that it should be a complete documentation taking a project from point A to point Z, from initiation to the closure activities of the project. And while we are doing that, we have to follow some kind of a procedure or some kind of a process. So these are some ideas of what should be done while developing a good WBS, or in the process of creation and development of a WBS. Gather all project-related materials that define solution, approach, and scope. So the first step in creation and development of a WBS is to start off with collecting and having all of the information that will help you design and define the activities of the project. Second step would be to review WBS for similar projects. Always an asset to have activities that were done to create similar projects. Now when you have collected all of the documentation, relevant documentation, and you have seen WBS of similar projects, you collect all that, and now you start off with a high level WBS, and that should only represent what? what needs to be developed. Taking the scope statement and breaking it down into very high level activities that defines what needs to be developed. Now when you have broken it down into the first level of groups, you will refine and decompose it to manageable and trackable level. If the first step is to divide it by the initiation, the planning phases, or the phases of the project life cycle, that is fair. You start off with initiation, the planning, the execution, monitoring, control, and then the closure, and you start off listing activities underneath it. Fair. Involve responsible project team members in developing the WBS. An activity that I kind of gave you in the previous slide. Whoever is involved with your project at that point in time, and adding on to some subject matter experts, some consultants, or some other team members who have done similar projects before, get them together in a team environment, in a room, and start drilling down into subsequent level of activities. So involve responsible project team members in development of the WBS. Include project support elements. Based on your experience, your expertise, and your education, or any other activity or any other experience of your team members at that point in time, add them all together and then use support elements. And the support elements will be the project management information system, the quality assurance team, and etc. Avoid developing details before it is needed. The best WBS are created in a stepwise situation. That means you create a very high level framework. So if you're planning a country, you define a country, then the province or the states, then the cities. Within the cities, you define a library, a mosque, a school, a hospital. Underneath that, for example, under the school, faculty, classroom, a high school, elementary school, girls, boys, co-ed, how many faculty, how many classrooms, how big a building, playground, no playground, science subjects, art subject. So it's that high level to subsequent lower level. But avoid developing details before it is needed. So if you're doing an IT project, identify how many web pages, the need, the purpose. Don't get into the detail of what is included in each of those pages. Review the structure with responsible stakeholders. This would be a time when a high-level framework, a high-level map is shared after the first initial meeting. Remember, informed customer is a happy customer. Share that with the responsible stakeholders. Get a buy-in, get some kind of commitment that you're going on the right track. Get their input into it. And then work your way into people who are responsible for delivering those work activities. So commitment from a high level to buy-in from the downward communication or your responsible team members, all coming together with the lateral communication. That means you have a buy-in from your vendors, your other line managers. So all will chip in and understand what the project priorities are, what are we signing up for, how many resources will be needed, what would be my role into this. If I need to provide resources, I need to understand that I need to provide those resources on a timely basis. Add appropriate elements to manage risk. Again, add in buffers, situations which can cause your projects to derail. The contingency reserves, situations, buffers, things that need to be added on, quality assurance, reviews, the test cases. What if the test fails? Do I have enough time or enough cushion to take care of those issues and get myself back on track? Remember, the bottom line is use good judgment. There are no hard and fast rules. Bottom line is to develop a group of activities that will help you as a project manager and help your team members and the responsible stakeholders into understanding the project scope, delivering and committing to delivering the project scope, and being accountable for it, and ultimately taking your project to the road to success and reaching the goal within time, within budget, on schedule, and delivering to the initial committed scope. If we move from the WBS, we are going to step into the next process, which is the scope verification process. The process of obtaining formal acceptance of the project scope by the stakeholders. The sponsor, the client, customer, project team, etc. Spend a little bit of time understanding what the stakeholders are expecting from you. Having an informed group of customers, and informed stakeholders who are going to feel committed and who feel comfortable and responsible for making sure that your project continues on the road of success. Any hurdles that are created by external or internal environment should also be taken care of by providing the right support and guidance by the project sponsors and the stakeholders. The scope verification process, and within it, let's look at some of the feeding inputs. Within your scope verification process, your WBS and the project plan is reviewed. So at this point in time, you should have all the activities at a very high level listed out with some kind of mindset that who will be doing those activities. A little bit of resource assignment is going in your head as a project manager, a little bit of estimation going on in your head. You are within the planning phase, so at this point in time, your project plan is reviewed, how to achieve the target, what are some of the supporting documentation, supporting elements that will be used by you and your organization and your team to reach the target. At this point in time, once you have collected all that information, a formal inspection by upper management is undertaken. So your project organization, along with the project customer, the senior sponsors, will actually look at all this information and they will go through something called a formal inspection. Another important inspection that should be taken at this point in time, or that will provide an aid to the project manager and the project management team, are by the SMEs, the subject matter experts, or the external consultants. It's always a good idea to procure the services of these external agents at this point in time, rather than waiting till the end when they become the criticizing factors for your project. Get their assistance, get their help early and upfront. so that during the planning phase, when you're only on the drawing board, you can use these resources effectively. Because remember, in the life cycle, you're starting to procure more resources and starting to incur more cost to the project. So these are still the early and the beginning phases where things can be changed, updated as and when needed. This whole scope verification process results in one thing, which is the formal acceptance of the scope of the project. What do we mean by the formal acceptance of the scope of the project? The formal acceptance is between the customer, the project organization, responsible, and now all the project team members and yourself are feeling responsible and accountable for the scope of the project. Everybody is feeling that the foundation is built on solid ground, and now you're ready to build upon it. The foundation is drilled, the foundation is built, the stones are laid, and you know that you're not standing on shaky grounds. You cannot start building a building. You cannot start putting together a building on shaky grounds. And you as a project manager, your customers, your sponsors need to feel good at this particular stage. Once we all feel good about what is required from this project, that is the time to baseline a project scope. From this point onward, you take a snapshot of the project and everybody is in agreement of what is required of the project. All updates, all modifications are not considered changes at this point in time. So until scope verification, you have that leverage of changing, updating, modifying scope, all in agreement between you as a team, your project team, the project organization, and the project customers. All are in agreement, project verification is done, a formal milestone is achieved, and you baseline the project. Baselining the project would be considered a major milestone in the project life cycle, and that is done in the planning phase. Moving on, not just the planning phase, moving on to the monitoring and the control phase. So that is the start of the execution phase. Under the scope change control, from this point onwards, all changes, whether small or big, whether they change the target date or not, all changes should be documented. And within the scope management plan, there is a process called the scope change control that is concerned with influencing the factors which create scope changes to ensure that the changes are beneficial, determining that a scope change has occurred, managing the actual change when and if they occur. So, under the scope change control, all changes that are going to come your way after verification and commitment of the initial scope should be documented, and there should be a process controlling all these changes. Scope change control. Any change request, if necessary, is reviewed and documented. Formal scope change control system is put in place and used if necessary. Remember, one of the more important components of the scope management plan document was identifying and documenting a change control process. That is also a placeholder to identify who will be part of your CCB board, the change control board. All that is going to take into effect. So the planning took place in the planning phase, and the actual monitoring and documentation and adding on will be done in the monitoring and the control phase of the project. The performance measurement system is also identified and documented at this point in time. And now this whole scope change control process will result in several things. Let's start off with scope changes. There will be changes. As project managers, we need to identify and understand that no matter how big or small the project is, there will be changes to the project. Once the changes are implemented, once it is approved and reviewed, and it is implemented, corrective actions will be taken. So when there are changes, they will be implemented. We need to understand that and we need to agree upon that. All that will result in lessons learned. Maybe the change was because of just a technological upgrade. Maybe it was because of an oversight. Whatever it was, the reason for change should be documented. The change itself should be documented. If it is because of an oversight, then it goes into the lessons learned document. We're going to talk about lessons learned, and I will highlight when or at what frequency lessons learned should be done. And last but not the least, once the change is implemented, your baseline would have to be adjusted to. Now, what was the baseline? The definition of baseline in simple layman terms was set in stone, right? Taking a snapshot of the situation at that particular moment in time and then basing it or using that as basis for comparing your actuals versus the planned. So your planned activity now, because of this particular change, will have to be readjusted. So this adjusted baseline, once the change is implemented, added to the WBS, the whole estimating process, the whole assigning of resources is all done. You take a snapshot of it again, and now you have a new baseline to compare planned versus the actual. In making key changes to project activities, it is important to have a formal change process and a formal CCB responsible for approving or rejecting changes. In making key changes to project activities, it is very important for all of us within the project organization and the customer organization to understand that we need to have committed and responsible CCB board members who understand the vision and the mission of the project, who understand the vision and the mission of the organization that is sponsoring the project. They also need to understand the project priorities. Why is it so important to bypass a change and meet the target end date? All these things are important for the CCB board members and the project manager to understand while implementing or documenting any change request. All this will lead into either approving or rejecting changes. Let's look at the change management document. We've talked about the change management process several times in the past 3 or 4 lectures. Let's be very clear about what we are trying to achieve from the change management process. So what are changes? Changes could be internal or external driven, right? The first group of stakeholders that see beneficial changes or see changes are the direct team members, the project team members, and the project manager. Before the project manager, the team members who are running the execution or are getting their hands dirty are the people that will see the changes, things to improve, things that were kind of out there because of an oversight. These are internal changes. External changes could be technology getting changed, major driven forces, many more examples of external changes. So external changes are mostly customer driven changes. Most of the time, external changes are welcomed by the project team members because it is seen as an enhancement to the project, or if it's not a fixed price project, more money, more work for the project organization, and is considered beneficial. However, if it's a fixed price project, then things are not going to stay the same. They are always seen as negative. So external changes are mostly customer driven changes. Internal changes are initiated from within the project team or the project organization. So again, going by the example of, if I'm working on something, and if I'm working on an IT process, or if I'm working on a report, by creating this loop or by eliminating the loop, I'm going to improve the response time multiple times. I would have to look at this task and to improvise improvement in it. I need to get some kind of an approval. It's an internal driven change. But a simple change can improve the response time. I'm going to go ahead and implement that change. But I would like to do that, but it still has to be logged, discussed with the customer, will definitely be used as a positive change. And then we need to decide how long will it take to change the usual format. If it's a 4-minute change, it still needs to be documented, but doesn't need to go through the rigorous change format. If it's a 4-week change and may change the end date of the project, then it needs to go through the change control board. Everybody needs to understand why a certain change is being implemented. There are so many examples out there, and I would like to share with you some of those, but again, every change is so unique. The implementation of the change is so unique. The way it is handled is unique. Change management is very important. Some issues, let's go back on the bullet. Some issues that cannot be resolved could become internal changes also. Yes. Risks are identified if they are implemented. That means if the risk happens, then it can become issues. Issues can sometimes become changes. There is a movement. So some changes could also be created because those are unresolved issues and ultimately would become changes in your project. Change management is very important for the project, and it should be monitored and enforced through the change control board. Well, change management process is extremely important for the project. We all understand that there will be changes to the project, no matter how big or how small the project is. There will be multiple changes. All change management, the change management document is supported by the change request form to formally make changes in the project. All changes, no matter how big or small, should be put into a document called a change request log. That should be updated whether change result is approved or rejected. So in a smaller project, any change which creates change in end time or affects the triple constraint, should be supported by a change request form, giving time, giving reason for implementation, who initiated it, how long, technical issues, estimates, budget, cost. In a detailed format, all that information should be dealt with and taken to the CCB board. So 2 documents, one is the change management process document, and then the 2 subsequent documents. One is a change request log. Any changes, whether approved or rejected, any small minor change or a major change should be documented in the change request log. And to simplify our lives, and in being in the initial phase of project management, any change that will affect the triple constraints of the project should go into another document which will contain much more information, detailed information by technical lead, by technical analyst, support, everybody pitching in, signing off, and ready to be taken to the change control board. So if a change hits the triple constraints, it should be approved or rejected by the change control board, and they will be the team or the group of people who will understand and who will decide whether this particular change should be implemented. Is it beneficial to the project or is it not? Or bypassing, again I'm using some of the same words, is bypassing this particular change is important because the ultimate delivery on time is more important than implementation of this particular change. So that is a change control process. Another one important aspect is the lessons learned. During the monitoring and the control phase, you will start looking at situations which are things that should be implemented or should be looked at in the next projects. We call it the lessons learned. Lessons learned is an important part of learning from good experiences during the project, and also documentation of things that did not go so well and had room for improvement. So 2 things. Things that really went well, and we as project managers should be in a situation to actually use those examples and practices in subsequent projects. And more often there are situations which should be avoided and things that did not go very well. These are considered the SADs, things that did not go very well, to the GLADs, the things that went very well. All projects should invest in well-organized and well-participated lessons learned meeting during the closure of projects or after the phase end review. Lessons learned should ideally, or as a practice, are usually done in the closure phase of the project. But what's the benefit to the team if it is always done at the closure phase? So in a large projects, lessons learned meeting should be done in the midlife of the project or at the end of every phase to learn from mistake and to actually reap the benefits during the life of the project. Project managers should always have a line item as an activity that has lessons learned meeting, time for lessons learned meeting, and to ensure that participation from the right individuals are made mandatory. Hence, projects should always invest in well-organized. There should be a facilitator. There should be a project team environment. We should use that as a team building tool to identify things that went well or things that did not go well in presence of a facilitator. It should be a well documented process also. So everybody comes in prepared, they all pitch in, they all have 2 or 3 things that went well and 2 or 3 things that did not go very well. They come in with this, and then there's a room for discussion. It's all documented and shared with the team and stored in a place where this information can be retrieved for future projects by future project managers and other project managers. Sometimes we are always in a situation where we don't think that these things are so beneficial, and people always have excuses for not attending. So I think in this situation, companies should enforce mandatory participation for these meetings. If it is part of the WBS and there are hours associated and participation list included of who will be attending these meetings, then it puts kind of a situation on a project manager to ensure participation and to mark off who attended versus who did not attend. And then there should also be a line item in the WBS where it should state that the whole process is documented and then communicated for further use and processing. So let's look at what is highlighted at the bottom of the slide. Organizations usually cannot complete the lessons learned activity because team members are quickly moved on to other projects, which leaves no time for this exercise. Coming back to initial statement saying it should not only be done in the closure phase, and the reason is during the closure phase, not only the team members are eager and ready to move on to different projects, you as a project manager also are actively looking out for new project or may already have one under your belt and you are in the initiation phases of it, thus leaving no time to do certain activities like lessons learned activity. So ideally, again, I will reiterate, if it is a line item into your closure activities for holding and there is a mandatory participation in these meetings and you know that this will be a well organized and a well participated meeting, then you will have facilitators responsible for documentation of what will go on and then shared appropriately also. Everybody will feel accountable and will feel the benefit that this whole activity has a benefit at the end of the project and will be used appropriately. So what is a lessons learned report? In some of the subsequent presentations, I will share with you some of the better approved or standardized templates that are out there for lessons learned. So what is a lessons learned report? I keep talking about documentation of what goes on in those meetings and then shared appropriately with the team members. These are reflective statements written by project managers and their team members to document important things that they have learned from working on the project. These could be things that went well or things that did not go very well, either way. But these are either statements or bullets. And these statements are shared by the project manager and the team members, and usually captured by a facilitator. And the reason that the project manager should not be facilitating this meeting is because he or she cannot appropriately share or discuss some of the issues that did not go very well. So project manager should just be a participant along with the other team members, and a facilitator should be out there to nudge people into obtaining the right kind of information. It is a best practice to document the lessons learned on periodic basis. So what is a periodic base? In a smaller project, during the midlife of the project would be a good time to do a lessons learned, and at the end of the project. In a larger project, at the end of the phase, at the end of every phase would be a good time to do a lessons learned. In a 1 year long project, for example, one lessons learned at the interval of 6 months and then one towards the end of the project is sufficient. In a 4 month or a 5 month long project, one lessons learned will be good enough. So there's no hard and fast rules again. Use your own determination, use your own mindset to understand when and how a lessons learned document should be updated. So we've gone through all the processes of project scope management, the knowledge area. If I want to sum it all up, I'm going to use, and this is all to encourage you to go out on the website and search for statements, understand the clarity. There's a lot of contradictions, right? There's no hard and fast rules. When I say that, it means my understanding or my perception will be a little different than somebody else who's sharing on or who's also contributing to the same concept. No matter what we do, we're all working towards the same goal of meeting or exceeding the customer expectation and meeting or delivering to the project scope. So if I go and look at what Wikipedia has to offer from the project scope management definition perspective, if requirements are not completely defined and described, and if there is no effective change control in a project, scope or requirement creep may ensue. Right? So now we are moving from the first process of project scope management, which is the collecting of the requirements. And we are saying that if at that point in time the first process is not completely defined and described, then you are actually going into something called a effective change control or in a project. And if there is no effective change control, then you are actually going into a scope creep or a requirement creep. So what are these creeps? What are these scope creeps and the project creeps and the product creeps? What are these creeps? Scope creep management is important for effective project management. Projects are expected to meet strict deadlines with resource restraints, and an unvetted and unapproved changes in the scope can affect the success of your project. Scope creep sometimes causes cost overrun. So the whole change control process, the entire scope change control process, from the identification, collecting requirement, to ultimately understanding it, defining it, and then managing all the changes and subsequent implementation of those changes. If we don't understand those changes and if there's not a process in place, then you are driving yourself to scope creep. Scope creep is a term which refers to the incremental expansion of the scope of a project. So you've identified it, you defined it, you planned it, you verified it. And now you start the execution of the project and changes start coming your way. And the start coming your way is the incremental expansion of the scope of the project, which may include and introduce more requirements that may not have been a part of the initial planning of the project, while nevertheless failing to adjust schedules and budget. There are two distinct ways to separate scope creep management. The first is business scope creep, and the second is called features, also the technology scope creep. So two. One, Wikipedia is referring to as the business scope creep, and the second that they are referring to as the functional, the features, or the technology scope creep. The types of scope creep management is always dependent on the people who create the changes. And who are the people who are creating these changes? There are two factors that we talked about, the internal and the external factors. Let's look at the first one, which is the business scope creep management occurs when decisions that are made with reference to a project are designed to solve or meet the requirements and needs of the business. The other one, the technology and the features, those are internal, external. While you're working on the project, it comes in, your technology changes, the Microsoft version that you were working with has now been upgraded, and all of a sudden you have to upgrade your tools. The technology changes, the servers get upgraded. There are multiple other reasons. But let's focusing back on the business scope creep. And if you read through the lines, it's saying that it occurs when decisions that are made with reference to a project are designed to solve or meet the requirements and needs of the business. Business scope creep changes may be a result of poor requirement definition early in the development project. So these could be what I call the oversights. Because the vision and the mission should be understood clearly. If you don't understand the project organization up front, if you don't understand the roles and responsibilities, if you don't understand why is there a need to undertake this project, you subsequently are going to run into situations which we are, or the Wikipedia is calling, the business scope creep. Business scope creep could also be the failure to include the users of the project until the later stage of system development life cycle. A lot of different terminologies that are being introduced if you go out into Wikipedia and just do simple project scope management, and you start coming up with these different terms and terminologies. With experience, you understand each one of them. If you don't have the experience, it will take you a little bit of time to understand some of these situations. But let's look at the last line and understand what are they trying to tell you. The failure to include the users of the project until the later stages of the project life cycle. All projects need to have a mission and the reason why we are undertaking them. Sometimes projects are done without having the end users in mind, and these are considered again failed projects because users don't see the benefit of the implementation of such projects. Does the project manager assume the responsibility? In most cases, no. Project managers are executioners. They take on the responsibility of taking a scope and delivering that scope. When the end users are not identified by the project organization, yes, those projects will be troubled or failed projects. However, it is not the responsibility of the project manager on the whole. It should have been the responsibility of the customer, project customers, and the project sponsors to identify the need for undertaking such a project. When end users are identified at the last moment and introduced to the project, and they don't see the benefit of the implementation of the project, these are the troubled projects. And these are the business scope creep towards the end of the project. When end users are identified, then they bring in new changes and more changes, and these are called the business changes. Again, this is the Wikipedia saying this. The project scope management, the 5 processes 3 falling in the planning phases, 2 in the verification, the monitoring and the control phases of it. The collecting requirement, defining the WBS, all this work needs to be done under the planning phase. Then the verification and the controlling or the change control process is taking place in the monitoring and the control phase. The importance of having a good scope management plan, the importance of writing a good scope statement is all underlined and all fairly clearly introduced to you in the last 2 lectures. And in the next lecture we will move on to the next knowledge area. Hopefully it is clearly understood. I would encourage you again to go on to the websites, go on to the reference materials and get a clearer understanding of what this knowledge area is all about. Wishing you best of luck, and I will see you in the next lecture. This is Ghazala Amin for PRM700. I will see you in the next lecture, inshallah. Take care of yourself and Allah Hafiz.